Carney has recently announced that central bank rates will remain unchanged in the UK, while the Fed suspended its December hike. What do you think is going to happen to central bank interest rates around the world in the next few years?
Well, I think if the economies continue to soften, people will resort to classic monetary policy and to facilitate recovery. The problem is we've never been in this kind of a situation where we've already used monetary policy, and basically it hasn't been effective enough to get us out of the slow growth kind of stuck period, particularly in the United States and Europe. Of course, there's still some economies that are doing fairly well. So I think I can't imagine a time when there's been more uncertainty in terms of traditional monetary policy, because the environment is not like the world in which monetary policy evolved. And recall that monetary policy is not expected to make a big difference in a really severe depression. You know, classically it was believed that you had to use fiscal policy. Well, in the Great Recession we used both, and there's widespread disappointment with the results from economists and from, I think, central bankers. Yes. So there's a kind of an agonizing adjustment, adaptation that has to take place, I think, among the professionals.
All right. Continuing on something you mentioned about us not having the option of monetary policy right now, how do you think a government would tackle a next recession in the next few years without monetary policy and with near zero interest rates?
Well, it's not clear that they're able to do very much. For one thing, there's the whole question of whether there's already governments tend to have fairly large amounts of debt, and their ability to do more deficit financing depends critically upon the willingness of investors to hold their debt. And there's a point, you see, if you're in Venezuela, people won't hold your debt. And of course, we saw the same thing with Greece, to a lesser extent, but still the same sort of thing in other countries in Southern Europe. If people won't buy your debt, then you're out of steam. You're out of ammunition with fiscal policy. So it ends up being a matter of when you can't do anything, what's the recovery process? And you know, most economies, they do recover. They will recover on their own. And you know, it's possible that a lot of the interventions have just. One of the interventions that we did, you see, was to prevent bankruptcies. And I think that's a problem. When you bail out incumbent investors, as we did with Bank of America, Citigroup, the largest banks in the United States, then you are giving, you see, if you didn't do that, those investors would lose their money, okay? Any new investors that come in get the full return of on new activity. And so there's a surge, you see, of activity because of the reward that would go strictly to new investors. When you share that with old investors, who normally, you see, would have been cleared out of the system, then you dilute that return. And I think you inevitably have a poorer recovery. So that I think that's one of the reasons why we've been stuck. And if you look at cases, especially in the early 90s, like in Sweden, Norway, and Finland, where they let the banks, the common shareholders basically lost their money, you see, and the system then sort of started over. The recovery tended to be better in those countries. And I think that's been an important part of the worldwide slump that we have been in. And I think when governments run out of steam, then we'll see whether this other will work.
Definitely. I'll take my last tangent about interest rates, and I'll ask you, what do you think of the possibility and effectiveness of negative interest rates, as seen for now in the European Central Bank and in the Bank of Japan? Do you think negative interest rates could work?
Well, they might, you see, because now you're no longer paying banks to not make loans. See, in effect, if the central bank is paying a positive interest on the deposits of the commercial banks in the central banks, then they're being paid not to lend that money out. If you think of it that way, you see. Now, when the central bank charges the commercial banks for holding deposits in the bank, it potentially changes their incentive. And so we'll see how that works. Of course, at the same time, if the economies are falling, there may be fewer opportunities for new investment. Although even in hard times, innovation usually is going forward. There's various kinds of we have a huge change in the production of hard goods, with all kinds of new 3D printing and this sorting coming online, and that so enormously reduces potentially the cost and the return on investment that some of those kinds of investments may be important in our recovery.
Fair enough. Most EU countries still haven't recovered the GDP they lost in 2008, while the US has done so years ago. Why do you think Europe is so sluggish in its recovery?
I don't feel I know the European situation well enough to really comment on those kinds of subtle differences. I'm not a macroeconomist. I'm an experimental economist, but I've sort of used experiments to try to help me better understand some of the main features of macro accounts. But I don't follow economic policy that closely, especially in other countries.
Sure. I'll try and move closer to home. This is a bit of a big question. Feel free to approach it how you like, but what do you think are the odds of a next recession in the U.S. In the next few years?
Well, I think there seems like in the last 2 or 3 months, there's been somewhat of an increase in the odds. I think it's still likely that we'll continue to grow very slowly, but I think the reports of corporate businesses that are showing some decline in revenue and the earnings are not as strong, those are kind of flashpoints that could develop into turn into a recession. But right now, you see that's not clear that will happen. It may be just a flat spot because the coincident indicators like employment is continuing to grow, if not as fast as it has in earlier months. It's nevertheless continued to go, and but I think it's. I'm still think the on balance the likelihood is that we'll continue. There will not be actually another recession. If there is, then I think there is a real important question as to how policy is going to have any influence in it, since we seem to be out of bullets.
Definitely, that's for sure. Moving in a different direction, do you think banks are regulated enough as of right now? And do you think a next financial crisis could be imminent?
I don't. I think there in certain areas, like we have some certainly severe debt problems in the among firms in the commodity and energy businesses, and if that grows and extends to other lines of businesses, then this could be, a serious problem. Certainly, there's been, I think, a lot of the easing of money has helped to fuel asset prices, especially securities markets. Housing has come along well, and is been. The latest data shows that in the United States it's continuing to recover, although it's new home building is anything like it's less than half what it was at the peak. So we still have a long ways to go. And of course, a lot of that, though, is being driven by a lot of our markets. The housing market has been driven by cash purchases, which is not. You don't expect that to continue. And some of those cash purchases are foreign, Chinese nationals buying in the United States. They see prices as really quite low in the United States compared with many of the cities in China. And then there's a lot of the cash purchases are probably people was expecting a turnaround in the housing market. Indeed, we do have a turnaround. And the question is, how soon will they be sellers in that market? And we don't know the answer to that question.
I'll ask you one last one, just
all right.
A quick general one. Do you think all economies are bound to slow down at some point?
No, I think there will be. There is typically a lot of variation in individual economies. I think economies that have reduced their costs, sort of tightened their belts, so to speak, are in a better position. And that's certainly true of some of the border states with Russia, Estonia, Latvia, also Ireland. Iceland, of course, had a massive decline, but not being on the euro, their currency dropped and greatly reduced their costs. And so a lot of those countries have been through a lot of pain already and gone through the adjustment that it takes in order to improve their export markets. And so I think there's a lot of differences like that will be showing up.
Well, that's all we have time
for,
so thank you very much. It was a pleasure.